All right, so this week I wanted to go over the infant classroom, just some important information to know and some tips and tricks on how to make that classroom the best possible experience for you. Before I jump in, who here has worked in an infant classroom before? All right, perfect. So it doesn't really sound like anybody has had too much experience. So, perfect. Linda said that she has. Okay. So when it comes to an infant classroom, some of the things to expect is that most centers will have a no shoe rule for the teachers in the infant room. This is mostly to keep out any germs that will come in from you walking with your shoes outside. The infants and young kids of this age, they are on the ground pretty much the whole time. And so at this stage, with them putting everything in their mouth, it just helps to keep that room a little bit more sanitary so that they aren't getting all of the germs from outside and on the ground onto their hands and in their mouth. So that's the biggest reason that there's this no shoe rule typically in these classrooms. They do allow socks typically, or if you choose, you can just go barefoot. But that's that rule. Typically, there is always a child to teacher ratio of 4 children to 1 adult, with the max group size in this being 8 infants with 2 teachers. And then if you are in the infant classroom, typically you're going to be in the infant classroom for your full shift. They don't normally move teachers around in and out of that classroom, just because it makes it pretty difficult to maintain the food schedules and the diaper changing schedule. Any questions before I move on from this slide? Okay. Anything else that you think that a new teacher should expect when they are entering in an infant classroom? Yes, Kathy.
Hello. I see that the teachers have like a kind of uniform, or are they providing us a uniform, or we just come dressed as we want?
Great question. So this is just a picture that I pulled from the internet. So they might have a uniform in this specific daycare that they're showing. Most daycares and preschools don't have uniforms though. So the casual to business casual that I typically tell people to wear is totally fine in the infant classroom. But great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions or comments before we move on? Perfect. So in the infant classroom, their schedule or lack thereof typically revolves around their feedings and their eatings and their sleeping times, which can sometimes be different for each individual child. Hence why I say the lack of a schedule. So this age group has a lot of big differences for being so close in age. I think it's within that first year that you're reaching majority of your milestones. So you're learning how to roll and crawl and sit and walk and stand, and you're going from just drinking formula or breast milk to eating pureed foods and cereals to eating more solid foods, and you're getting teeth. But because of how quickly this age group is going through those milestones, you're going to have a lot of kids that are in different milestones, which is the biggest reason that it's hard to make that schedule. These kids, when they go through growth spurts, they get more tired or less tired. When they're teething, they have a harder time falling asleep. So all of these things just make it very hard to have a schedule that isn't child-based and group-based. So just kind of expect that it's going to be more of an individual schedule than it is going to be a whole group schedule. But as long as you're following the childcare licensing rules and regulations when it comes to the kids these age, this classroom is honestly my favorite classroom to be in. So some of the scheduling that you will have with each individual child is your diapering and your feeding times. So diapering, it's required to happen or to be checked at least every 2 hours. If you check a diaper and it is dry, you don't have to change the diaper. Typically you wait for another hour and then you check them again. If they are wet or poopy before that 2 hour mark, again, it's expected that you will change that diaper when that comes about. But it has to be checked at least every 2 hours. Your feeding schedule, you need to offer it at least every 3 hours. But again, typically these kids will tell you when they are hungry. And you typically will go off of their schedule and the schedule that their parents have said that they should be on. So for example, I have a 4-month-old. He typically eats every 2 to every 2.5 hours. But sometimes he's hungry before that. And so I just say, like, whenever he's giving you the hunger cues, I am fine with you feeding him then. But if he hasn't at least wanted a bottle by that 3 hour mark, you need to at least offer it. If he doesn't take it, that's okay. You still have to have offered the feeding. And then once he does start showing the hunger cues, that is when you will offer the bottle at that point. I don't think there's anything else. Okay, so this is just a quote, but it's each infant and toddler shall follow their own pattern of sleeping and eating. So again, diapering has to happen at least every 2 hours or whenever they need a diaper change before that 2 hour mark. But sleeping and eating, these kids, these infants, these toddlers, because of how much growth and learning they're doing, their sleeping schedule changes, their eating schedule changes. So you really should be following their cues. Before I move on to the next slide, is there any questions about any of these things or any comments or experiences that you have with following these things?
I have a question.
Perfect.
So some of the daycares, like when they offer the bottle to the baby, then they just like leave it out and keep offering it for several hours. Is there a time limit that they're supposed to like get rid of it and get a new one?
That is a great question. I don't remember the exact timing. I do know that I have a slide that goes over that. Okay. But there is actual rules on how long a bottle is supposed to be kept out, how long a bottle is good even after it's refrigerated. I believe that if you leave it out, it is only good for up to an hour. So yeah, within that hour, you're good, but I would highly encourage putting it away. Even if they're hungry 5 minutes later, it is always better to go and grab it out of the fridge than to be dumping that milk, because if it's breast milk, like the mother can only pump so much. And if it's formula, formula is really expensive.
Right.
So I do know that I have a slide that goes over that. And I unfortunately haven't been in an infant classroom recently enough that I really remember those times just off the top of my head.
Okay.
Any other questions though? Okay, perfect. So with the feedings, perfect. This is where we will go over that. Formula must be labeled with the child's name. So their specific formula can typically needs to be labeled with their name. And then as well as their bottle. Typically, daycares will have just different kinds of bottles, and then you can get a piece of tape and label it on the bottle that way. If they have their own bottles, then the parent can choose whether or not they want to write Sharpie on it. After a couple washes though, the Sharpie does come off. So just be aware of that as you're going through. Typically you'll have to remark whose bottle is whose. When you have made a bottle, you have to label the bottle with the date and the time of preparation. So for example, if I made little Susie a bottle today, right now, I would put on the bottle that it was Susie's bottle. And then I would also put that the date is 9/14. You don't typically need the year because you're not going to be a whole year later with these same bottles. But 9/14, and then the time is 6:13 right now. And then you need to discard the bottle after the feeding or within 2 hours of initiating the feeding. So basically what that means is if they have eaten the whole bottle, then you typically rinse it out and you set it aside. So it's not really discarding it, but you're cleaning it, rinsing it out. And then within the 2 hour mark is when that bottle needs to be completely discarded. So even if you've stuck it in the fridge, it needs to be discarded. And then if you do need to heat or reheat a bottle, you need to test it every single time before you give it to the child. The best way to test it is on the inside of your wrist, just like right here. You'll dump just a couple drops on there. If it is too warm for your wrist, it is going to be too warm to stick in their mouth, and it will burn them if you do so. So really, really important that you're testing these bottles before you offer them to the child. I do also know it's not listed here, but if you do reheat a bottle, so if you stick it in the fridge and then you take it out and reheat it, you cannot re-refrigerate it after you heat it. So at that point you would either need to discard it if it's been 2 hours, or it is good for, again, up to that 2 hours after you have prepared it. Questions with formula or breast milk before we move on to your bottle or your pureed foods? Okay, last thing before I go on, I do know that some daycares have stricter rules than what is on here. Please, 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 if the daycare tells you to do something a certain way, as long as it is following the rules that childcare licensing has set, if it's more strict than that, please follow them. It is the policies and procedures that that daycare has chosen to do. And we just need to be respectful of them. This information mostly is just so that you know what is required by the state as you go into these daycares. So with your pureed foods, again, it needs to be labeled with the child's name as well as the date and time of preparation or the opening of the container. Your food that you would have to prepare is your rice cereals or your oat cereals. Everything like your pureed foods, you won't be preparing yourself. They should already come ready to go, typically in a prepackaged container. These pre-pureed foods or whatever, they are good up to 24 hours once they are opened. So once you've opened them, you can reclose them up, put them back in the fridge, and they are good for 24 hours. If it's a powdered formula or powdered dry food, such as your rice cereals and your oat cereals, those are not considered 24 hours until they have been prepared. So meaning you have put the formula into water to mix it, or the dry foods, whether it's the milk or water that you prepare it with, that is when it's considered prepared, and that is when your 24-hour time starts. With all of your jarred or prepackaged foods, it's considered 24 hours as soon as you open it. So those are the things to note with your feedings. Any questions in general before we move on, or anything that you have experienced that you wish to bring up at this time? Perfect. Okay. So going on, your nap time. With kids, again, remember that their sleep time is when they say that they're tired. Most parents will say that they typically sleep in this schedule, but again, their schedule is changing so much that there's not really one. When it comes to where the children can sleep, they are required to sleep in equipment that is designed for sleep, such as a crib, bassinet, porta-crib, or playpen. They are not allowed to be placed to sleep on mats or cots, bouncers, swings, car seats, other pieces of equipment that are not designed for sleeping. So if a parent, the biggest question I normally get is, what if the kid is already asleep in the car seat when the parent drops them off? If that is the case, you should be removing them from the car seat and placing them in a crib and hoping that they stay asleep. If not, it's not the end of the world if they wake up. So, but again, we need to make sure that they are in equipment that is specifically designed for them to be sleeping in. Infants and toddlers are not supposed to be put on their stomach to sleep unless there is documentation from a doctor or other healthcare provider because of a medical condition. I get a lot of questions with this one on, well, what if the child rolls over in their sleep or rolls over before they fall asleep? That is fine, but you are not to place them on their stomach to fall asleep. And if they are wrapped in a swaddle, which binds their arms to their side, they, if they roll over, they need to be rolled back onto their back. So again, Safe Sleep Practices states that infants and toddlers should be placed on their back. This mostly is to prevent if they roll onto their stomach and they can't lift their head yet. It prevents them from suffocating, or if they're placed on their stomach and they can't roll back, again, that same thing, they can get their face buried in the mattress and not be able to breathe, and they would end up suffocating. So that is the biggest thing with how they are to be placed in these childcare or in these sleeping equipment. Other things to note, infants, when they are under the age of 1 year old, are not allowed to have blankets in the crib with them during naps, and binkies with attachments are also not allowed. Typically, if the parent brings a binky with the attachment on it, you can just take the attachment off for nap time. Or if they seem like they won't really need it to sleep, you can also just not give them a binky. But these are not allowed in the sleep equipment with them. Again, choking, suffocation hazard. Other rules when it comes to their sleeping equipment, they are not supposed to have things like crib bumpers on them. Again, that safety hazard of suffocating. Other than that, are there any questions that you have with experiences that you've had or about things that comes to nap time? Okay, perfect. Just a couple more slides, and then we are done with this training. So the next thing that I'm going to go over is the diapering procedure that most daycares follow. This is the one that Child Care Licensing has put out. But again, there are some daycares that follow a more strict diapering routine than this. And so please follow the daycare's instructions when it comes to that. But when it comes to what Child Care Licensing has stated, PDF has moved. Perfect. Okay, well, I can find the documentation on it later, but basically, when it comes to diapering, there are multiple steps that you're supposed to follow. So again, every child needs to have their diaper checked every 2 hours at least. So when you have determined that a child needs to be changed, before you even place them on the diapering pad, whether it's up high, a changing station, in a different room, whatever it is, before you place the child on that changing station, you are supposed to wash your own hands and gather their supplies. Supplies being diapers and wipes, and then bum cream potentially as well. After you have gathered their supplies, that is when you will then place the child onto the diaper changing station. Some daycares have gloves. If they have gloves, you are supposed to use them. If they don't have gloves, then you are okay if you just wash your hands before and after. But again, if they have gloves, you will put the gloves on, and then you will undress the child and then remove the soiled diaper. Typically, if it is just wet, you are fine to put it in a covered trash can. If it is a poopy diaper, they oftentimes have separate diaper changing trash cans that you will need to place the poopy diaper in. It does have to be a covered trash can. After you have removed the diaper, you will then wipe the child. Whether it is a boy or a girl, you always wipe from front to back. So so from front to back. The reason for this being that, especially on girls, when you wipe back to front, you are introducing bacteria and germs that should not be in their vaginal area, and it can also cause urinary tract infections. So again, as long as you're wiping front to back and making sure that we are not introducing those germs and bacteria up to the front, you're good. Once you have totally cleaned the child, then you are able to, then you should remove your gloves and dispose of the diaper and the gloves. At this point, to put a diaper back onto the child, you don't need to re-put on gloves. but you will at that point put the new diaper on the child and then reclothe them. You at that point should be washing the child's hands and then washing your hands and then cleaning the surface. Typically daycares have a cleanser that is right there available for you to spray and to wipe down. Some daycares have cleansers that need to sit for a couple minutes. And so typically in those situations, you can spray it and then wash your hands and then go back and clean it. Whatever the case is, as long as you are following those typical steps, and then as well, whatever the daycare requires as well, you should be good. That was a lot of information for the diaper changing process. Does anyone have questions with those? Okay, and then I will find the actual document that has the steps on it. And I will post a link in the YouTube video when I post the YouTube link. So I think we just have a couple more slides. So in daycare centers, it is required that we are documenting the feedings, diaperings, and naps for all infants and toddlers under the age of 2. So when you mark down these feedings, and I can just show you what it looks like. When you mark down the feedings, you'll mark down what time you offered them the bottle and how many ounces they drank. So not how many ounces you made, but how many ounces they actually drank. And then this one has like the breast formula or milk there. But most documentation, it doesn't actually need that. If they had a feeding that wasn't a bottle, it's considered a meal. You will also need to write down the time that you offered them that and then what it was. So if it was the pureed peas and carrots, you'll put down peas and carrots, and then how much they ate. Typically it's like 1 jar, half a jar, 1/4 of a jar, anything like that. So that's your feedings. When it comes to diapering, you will write down the time that you checked them. Whether you change them or not, you will always write down the time that you checked them. Because again, as I said, if they aren't wet or poopy at the time that you check them at the 2-hour mark, you don't have to change them, but you do need to be changing them again at the 3-hour mark. But the state needs to see that you are checking them at least every 2 hours, which is why, again, you have to write down even if they are dry. So again, you'll write down the time that you checked them, and then you'll mark whether they were dry, wet, if they had a bowel movement, if they were wet and poopy, you'll mark both. And then for your kids, because again, if they're 2 and under, if they're potty training, you'll write down if it was on the potty or not. For sleep times, you'll write down the time that they fell asleep and then the time that they woke up. So if the kid was to fall asleep at 4:30, you'd write 4:30, and then they woke up at 6, you'd write 6. The biggest reason that they want us to document these things is because the biggest question that doctors ask whenever something is going wrong with the child is, are they eating like very often? How often are they eating? How much are they eating? How many poopy diapers do they have in a day? How many wet diapers do they have in a day? How much sleep are they getting? So all of these things we're documenting so that the parents can know, so that they can alert their doctors if things start to seem off or weird or different. So last slide before we'll go into questions or comments from you guys. So playtime with the infants. There are a lot of different things that infants and toddlers have access to, such as your bouncers, your walkers aren't really allowed in daycares, but bouncers, different seats like their bumbo chairs, different things like that. Infants are not supposed to be confined to those play areas, whether it's a crib, a playpen, a bouncer, different thing, for more than 30 minutes. You can move them from one piece of equipment to the other, but typically, once you take them out, you should allow them to have some floor time. So again, they should not be in these pieces of equipment for more than 30 minutes. Biggest reason being, if they're only in one area the whole time, they're only working on one set of muscles, and it doesn't allow them the growth and development that they need at this stage. So they should be moving around to different areas. Infants and toddlers are also, if you take them outside, they are not supposed to be outside in the same play areas as older children, unless there are 8 or less kids in the group. So again, typically when you're outside, you'll be in your own designated infant area. And then awake infants and toddlers need to have interaction from an adult or caregiver at least every 20 minutes. So this means that even if you've stuck them in a bouncer, you should be interacting with them while they're in that bouncer. You should be interacting with them if they're laying on the floor, on their back, on their stomach. But the biggest reason for that being is kids at this age, they learn from interaction and they learn from stimulation. And so if they aren't getting any interaction or that stimulation from the caregivers, then they aren't learning the things that they need to be learning. Any questions or comments when it comes to anything that we went over? Or do you have any experiences or insight on things that you want to share with the group about infant classrooms? Okay.